Hello, 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 and welcome back to Shiksha Costa. Today we're going to start a unit on solving financial problems that involve exponential functions. By the end of this unit, hopefully you're able to demonstrate that you understand compound interest and something called annuities, and then solve problems that are related to those two concepts. Specifically, you should be able to compare simple and compound interest using tables of values and graphs, and given a fixed interest rate over time. Then you should be able to solve problems that involve the calculation of the future value or amount of an investment that is where you're given the principal or the initial value and using the compound interest formula. Then that's given to you right here. You should also be able to determine that compound interest is actually an example of exponential growth, and then solve problems using something called a TVM solver that involve calculating the interest rate and the term or the number of compounding periods in that very same formula. Finally, you should be able to explain what the term annuity means, and of course we will learn that. And you'll be able to do that by investigating the numerical and graphical representations of that using technology. And last but definitely not least, you should be able to determine through investigation using technology what happens when you change the conditions of very ordinary simple annuities. Oh, sorry, lied. There is one more. You should also be able to solve problems that involve the amount, the present value, and the regular payment of an ordinary simple annuity. So to get started in this unit, suppose that you want to start selling a board game that you've made at home. Before you can sell the game and start earning revenue, and revenue is of course the amount of money that you make, you actually have to spend money on expenses. You have to produce your game. You have to manufacture it. How do you get that money? Well, you can't sell your game before it's made. So how do you start getting the money to actually produce the game for you to sell? It's kind of like a vicious cycle happening here, right? Well, luckily we have lots of options. First, you could get another job. Any job that doesn't involve you actually putting your own money up front, you can get that job and save up your paychecks until you have made enough to fund your own adventure here. You could get your parents or guardians to give you some money. You could beg somebody who loves you very much for that kind of cash. You could go to a financial institution and borrow that money, and they might charge you a fee for borrowing money. And finally, you could actually take this idea that you're starting a board game production company and imagine that you are taking your entire company and breaking it up into shares. So you're breaking it up into partial ownership, and then you're selling part of your shares, those ownership shares, to other people. So we'll examine this idea here of you splitting up your company into different shares and selling them to people who think that your company is actually worth quite a bit of money. Maybe they've looked at your game and they say, when this guy starts selling, his company will really, really take off. So, and while we get into this, we're just going to set this idea aside for later. This idea that you can borrow money from a financial institution, we'll set this aside to look at in more detail later. For now, you've split up your company. You've made sure to keep at least half of the shares for yourself, but the remaining shares, so that you can maintain control of your company, but the remaining shares you want to sell to these other people called investors. Okay. You transfer your shares to them, they give you money, and now you have a whole bunch of money that you can use to fund manufacturing your board game. Now, these people might decide, this was actually a pretty good deal. This board game is making a lot of money. This company seems like it's more and more valuable. They might actually want to sell their shares to someone else. Somebody else might say, I want a piece of this action, but there's no more shares available to buy. So they may go to one of the investors And they might say, hey, I'll offer you some more money, more than what you paid for your share of the company. So this person not only made the exact same money that they have that they put up in the first place to help you fund your company, but they've sold their share for something that is even more than what they paid. And that amount, that profit that they have made, can also be called something called interest. This is what happens on the stock market. This happens thousands and thousands of times every second, every day. People buying and selling shares or pieces of companies in order to make profit or interest. What is interest? Interest is money that is paid regularly at a particular rate for the use of money lent. So in this case, you might imagine that you lent some money to this person, and in return, they lent you some money in return for a piece of your company. And you may want to be actually the one that goes to them and buys it back. And you may want to pay them more money than you originally got from them. And you could look at that in some sort of way. You might look at that as money that's paid in exchange for the chance to borrow money in the first place. That is what interest is. Another way to look at interest is when you're borrowing money from a financial institution. So you, from a bank or a credit union, you might borrow money, and then you might have to pay that money back, and you may also have to pay a little bit of extra money in order to give them a little bit of profit for lending you money in the first place. Let's explore this idea of interest a little bit more. So to examine this idea of simple interest, suppose you want to rent a car. You go to a rental car company, you say, man, I want your finest car for this road trip that I'm going on. What are some of the things that could change or impact the amount of money that they will ask you to pay? Well, one thing could be the type of car. A cheaper car might cost less money to borrow, whereas a more expensive exotic car might be quite expensive. Another thing that they could could impact the price that you'll pay is the duration of the rental. Some rentals might only be for a few days, and that's not as expensive as borrowing a car for an entire week or more. And finally, the rates of the rental car companies. Some rental car companies don't charge you very much at all, whereas others might charge you quite a lot of money. And that depends, they're not necessarily giving you a different car. Some of them just might charge you more money because maybe they feel like their service is better or they have more expenses. This idea, at the end of the rental period, what actually has to happen, no matter what car you choose, no matter how long you rent it for, no matter which company you rent it from, what has to happen at the end of the rental period? Well, you still have to return the car in the same condition that you got it. Now you actually have to pay that fee. Similarly, when you borrow money from a bank or other sort of lender, you have to return all the money in just like you have to return the car in the same condition, in the same value. But on top of returning the money, you also have to pay a fee just for getting the chance to borrow that money in the first place. When we talk about interest, the amount that you have borrowed is something called the principal. That is the amount that you have borrowed or lent. That's sort of like the value of the thing that is being lent out. Similar to how certain cars are more valuable than others. The duration of that rental, maybe renting that car for longer, is something called the term in terms of finance. So when you're borrowing money, the term is the length of time in years that the money is actually borrowed for. Sometimes you may want to borrow the money for longer than others. And finally, the rates of the rental company is something called the interest rate. The interest rate is a percentage of the principal. So it might be 10% of what you've borrowed, 15%, 3%. The more you borrow, of course, the higher the total interest is, but the interest rate is always a percentage of the principal. And you pay that every year as sort of like a fee for borrowing that money. So let's just return to our question here and talk about what if you did not want to sell shares of your company? What if you want to borrow money from a financial institution instead? Suppose a bank lends you that money to get started, and they require you to pay back all the money that you borrow plus $4 per year for every $100 that you borrow. How much would you actually have to pay back? If you don't need $100, that won't get you too much. You need $10,000 to build all of your boxes and print all of your pieces and all of that, and test and play test and pay employees. And you need to borrow $10,000. You need to keep it for 5 years. You don't think you're going to make a profit for 5 years. How much will you have to pay back at the end of 5 years? Pause the video here and see if you can figure this out for yourself. Well, the way I started to tackle this was I realized $4 per year for every $100 means that if I'm borrowing $10,000, this is sort of like $4 for every 100 is another way of saying that is per cent. Cent is the root word of 100, like century. So this is like $4 per every $100 is the same thing as zero. If I divide those, I get 0.04, which as a percentage is 4%. $4 per every $100 borrowed. Now, 4% of 10,000 is 0.04 times, when you use the word of, that means multiply. 0.04, this is 4% as a decimal. So 4% of 10,000 is $400. That means that every year, per year, you will need to pay this bank back $400 as interest. So let's look at a diagram of what this might look like. This is a timeline, and in year 1, you've borrowed $10,000. So for this first year, you need to pay back $400. In the second year, now you need to pay back $400 for this year. You need to pay back another $400 for borrowing it for a third year. Another $400 for borrowing it for a fourth year. And finally, a final $400 for borrowing it for the fifth year. In total, how much do you need to pay back to this bank? Well, you need to pay back the original amount that you borrowed, the exact value, plus the fee. And the fee is $400 times 5, because it was for 5 years that you borrowed this money. The total fee would then be $12,000. So $2,000 in interest and $10,000 in principal. That is the amount that you borrowed to get started. How did we calculate $12,000? Let's examine our formula for a second. We took the principal that we have to pay back, plus we have to pay back the interest. And the interest per year, we took the rate of 4%, and we multiplied it by the principal to get the amount of interest per year. And then we have to multiply that by something called the term. Remember, we talked about the term is the number of years. This is the formula for something called simple interest. P plus P times R times T. That is how you calculate how much money you need to pay back at the end of the term when you're borrowing money at a certain rate. So that is the formula for simple interest. And notice that because there's a P in this term and a P in this term, we can do something called factoring. We can common factor this. We can divide both of these by P, and we end up with P divided by P is just 1. Anything divided by itself is 1. And PRT divided by P will cancel out the P's, and we'll end up with just RT. This would be P divided by P is 1. 1 times RT is just RT. So this is actually a slightly better version of the same formula. Notice that when we multiply this by P, we will end up right back here. P times 1 is P.
P times RT is PRT. Now I can use this formula to find out stuff like, how much would I owe if I borrowed $5,000 at an annual simple interest rate of 12%? How much would I have to pay back after 1 year? So hopefully you were able to use this formula. This is the one that we're going to try and use so that we can learn the compound interest idea a little bit better. I'm going to start off with the formula, and then I'm going to look at my problem here to find out which of the variables I actually know. I know that the principal is 5,000. I know the interest rate, that's 12%. The principal is 5,000, and the term is the number of years. That's only 1 year. And so if I take these variables and I plug them in to my formula, I would get 5,000 times 1 plus 0.12, that's 12% as a decimal, just divided by 100, times t, which is just 1 year. So let's see what this turns out to. What is 0.12 times 1? Well, that's just 0.12. Plus 1 would be 1.12. And if I multiply that by 5,000, I get 5,600. So this is the amount that I would owe on a loan after 1 year if I borrowed $5,000 at 12%.
So interest is a fee for borrowing money, but it can also be used to mean investment profit. Interest on a loan is calculated by taking the principal and multiplying it by the interest rate for every single year of the term. When we talk about simple interest is just calculated on the principal. And the formula for a debt or a loan that is growing according to simple interest, the amount that you have to pay back at the end is calculated by P plus PRT. A is the amount of the debt. P represents the principal or the amount that is borrowed at the beginning. R represents the annual interest rate. And T represents the term, which is the number of years. If investments and debt, they both grow in value as time passes on. They both grow in value. Increasing the principal, increasing the interest rate, or increasing the term would necessarily increase the total amount of interest that you pay at the end. If you like this video, please like, rate, subscribe, and join our mailing list. And you can find this lesson as well as practice questions, solutions, handouts, and more on our storefront. Thanks and have a great day.